Hey guys, Trevor Reed here. So for today's topic, I recently went on a flight and had a engine running rough. So I decided to review my one engine in-op procedures, and luckily my local flying club was having a training course on that. So essentially that is what this presentation will be about. Without further ado, we will go ahead and get into it, starting with single pilot resource management. Thanks. And so again, single pilot resource management is a really big thing in any aspect of aviation. Being able to operate an aircraft using every single resource possible to be safe and complete your flight safely. So I mean, this starts with a thorough pre-flight. So just going around the aircraft, making sure everything's good. Inside the cockpit and outside, so it begins there, making sure you know your airspace, making sure you know your runway lengths, landing and takeoff distance, weight and balance, stuff like that. No such thing as a routine flight, regardless of what you're doing, if it's a local or across country. So I treat everything the same, and this is no exception. And so the really big thing when it comes to single engine on a twin engine is VMC, which is essentially just the minimal control speed on one engine when there's an engine failure. This is indicated by the blue dash on the airspeed indicator, and you don't want to be below that, because if you are indeed below that, you're going to have a tendency to roll toward the critical engine, which could ultimately result in a spin, and I've seen crashes like that on rotation. They lose an engine, they're below VMC, that aircraft has a violent asymmetric thrust, won't straight into the ground, so it's not a good thing. So the big thing is, if we do lose an engine on takeoff, the biggest thing is to maintain aircraft control, airspeed, and reach that VMC if we're off the ground. That's really the biggest thing. VMC and stall speed, so regardless, the stall speed will still be the same even when you're at VMC, regardless if you climb an altitude or not. As you gain altitude, VMC actually decreases due to I guess the decrease in pressure in the air, so the propeller's not operating as efficiently. So that would be why that decreased. It also changes with weight and CG location, so that's another thing to be aware about. Depending on your aircraft configuration, that could also change the VMC speed as well, if you've got flaps set or no flaps. The windmilling propeller, that's used for a restart, so that's something you need to keep in mind. Another big thing is P factor. So typically in a twin engine, the critical engine is the left engine due to how much further away the right engine's center of thrust is. So you're going to have an increased P factor from that right engine. So to counter that, some aircraft actually have counter-rotating props. So the left rotates clockwise and the right will rotate counterclockwise to kind of minimize that adverse yaw in case of a engine failure. But typically you find your normal clockwise rotating propellers in twin engine. That's about up with that, so we need to be aware of that. And you got to be able to identify an in-op engine. It does nobody any good if you accidentally shut down the engine that is inoperative. So a little saying is dead foot, dead engine, so you can feel it. You can check with the throttles, and you can check with the inclinometer. So typically you're going to bank toward the inoperative engine, so that would be another thing to keep in mind. Lastly, depending on your situation with the engine failure, would be determined if you feather that engine or not. So let's say you're approaching to land, you're coming down, you're already slow, right, because you're descending. You're probably not going to feather that engine. You're probably going to go ahead and try and stick that landing out and finish it. Let's say if you're in flight, you might feather it to try and get a restart to minimize that drag, that induced drag it's creating, and effectively get a restart. But now if you're trying to windmill restart, you're not going to want to feather that engine. So that's something you want to keep in mind. Lastly, memory and checklist items. So again, you go through your memory items and you back that up with a checklist. So we've got your typical flows for an in-op engine. You go through those, back up with a checklist, get that thing restarted. And lastly, there's aeronautical decision making, and it's the same for me every single time. I start with the PAVE checklist, begins with pilot. That starts with the I'm safe, so I make sure that I'm set and ready to make this flight. I'm not sick, fatigued, haven't had alcohol, any medication, drowsy medication, stuff like that, allergy meds. And then I go to the aircraft, make sure it's airworthy, inspections are up to date, equipment's all operative that needs to be operative and required, and anything that's not, I will take care of. Environment, I'm knowing my destination airport runway lengths, my takeoff and landing distance, my weight and balance, my NOTAMs, the environment I'm flying into, obstacles, things like that. And then finally, external pressures. You don't know exactly what I'm making that flight for. It could be just a normal training flight, so not a whole lot of external pressure there. You want to get it done, or I could be flying to a business meeting, something like that. So I just need to keep that in mind. Thanks.